So to close, we have a very distinguished final speaker, and that is an understatement, actually. Gar Alperovitz is a historian, political economist, activist, writer, and former government official. He is the Lionel Bauman Professor of Political Economy at the University of Maryland and is the author of critically acclaimed books on the atomic bomb and atomic diplomacy. He has written widely in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, the Nation, and the Atlantic. He's been a guest on numerous TV and cable news programs, including Meet the Press, Larry King Live, Charlie Rose Show, Crossfire, and The O'Reilly Factor as well. Interestingly, and to me this is very, very interesting, he is the architect of the first modern steel industry attempt at worker ownership in Youngstown, Ohio. He is also the president of the National Center for Economic and Security Alternatives and is a founding principal of the University of Maryland-based Democracy Collaborative, a research institution developing practical, policy-focused, and systemic paths towards ecologically sustainable, community-oriented change and the democratization of wealth. After he speaks, hopefully there'll be time for question and answers. And so let's welcome Dr. Alperovitz on stage.
Well, thank you for having me. And thank you. I've been sitting in the crowd, and as some of you know, I've been asking people at lunchtime, what should I talk about? Which usually drives people crazy when, I have a few remarks, but what I was really asking is who's here and what do people care about and what have they heard and what is most appropriate to emphasize for a group like this. So my first question is, how many are researchers? Hands, I'm trying to get a sense. Okay, how many are government officials? Work in the government? How many are activists? You can be both, Okay, got a sense. What I want to do is, and I want to mention this just at the outset, because I want to raise some difficult problems. And I want to say, by way of beginning that, I have run a sort of experience you all have. I'm a researcher. I was a legislative director in both houses of Congress and policy planning in the State Department. So I've been there, done that, and I want to raise questions about how people like us can either be part of the next solution, even as we do our jobs, or how we can hold it back, and that may be the issue of governance. And I'm going to talk about systems, but in the bottom line, it's existential. So I'm talking to the person in your chair and mine, and the question I'd like you to sort of let hang here is whether, as in your own role of work, but also in your role as a citizen, are you open to the next really big possibility? Can you help it along even as you do your job? Or is it your job to say that really goes too far? Okay, so that's the question. Let it hang there. And I want to start by saying David Orr, who's a very good friend of mine, is part of a project that has just begun. It's called the Next System Project. And it's an attempt to become articulate and serious about something most people sense, namely that we face power problems in American capitalism. Of course, socialism has had its own power problems that are systemic in nature, and that if we don't find a way to actually talk about this, speak about it, come up with real solutions and pathways, even as we do our regular jobs, we will lose the game, particularly in connection with climate change. So that's a very tricky question, because most people say, you can't change the system. Ask yourself. And besides, everything else we know about other systems is worse. So it's a very, very difficult challenge, both existentially and intellectually. A lot of problems are political. Some of them are also intellectual. So let it hang there as, might there be a possibility, just possibility, that we live at a time when the foundations for the next system beyond corporate capitalism and beyond state socialism just possibly might be being established bit by the kind of things that are going on in communities, that are going on in states, that are going on in regions, that are going on intellectually. Ideas do matter. Might that be a possibility? Most people can't handle that. Most people think, no, that's crazy talk. However, I just want to mention to you, I was asked to give a keynote address last summer by the Academy of Management. Anybody know what that is? 29,000 business school professors and corporate advisors worldwide. The subject of their entire main theme of their conference was, is capitalism over? We must debate this, and where are we going? Yes, no, but how do we talk about it intelligently rather than rhetorically, et cetera? As you may know, the founder of the huge meeting of businessmen that meets in Davos also raised that question publicly. Are we facing a major crisis of capitalism? Is that possible? You may know that people under 30, when asked the question, do you prefer socialism or capitalism? In 3 surveys now, slightly more positive response to the word socialism. And I don't think they know what either of those words really were about, but the response is different from what you might expect. The bottom line is that there is, and I wear a historian's hat as well as a political economist's hat, when you see in the society more and more people actually thinking, is there a system problem? Actually talking about it, it tells you something about possibility, very preliminary. When I say preliminary, one of my jobs in government, I was legislative director to a guy named Gaylord Nelson. How many know? Founder of Earth Day. Gaylord was a conservation governor. He became an environmental senator and later an ecological leader. There was a process in which things that started out over here began to take on greater form. And it is a possibility, I throw it to you to land in your lap to just look at, that this kind of preliminary talk about systems, might there be a different path, just possibly may be the beginning points for something different. Now, I've got to do 3 or 4 things like this because people usually say, well, yeah, maybe. How many of you understand what happened when the feminist movement exploded? The greatest cultural revolution in modern American history was always predicted not possible until bit by bit, it exploded. The same can be said of the civil rights movement, which for many years was way below the surface and people were threatened and indeed murdered in Mississippi if they raised questions. Impossible to change. Democracy as well. So I'm putting this into the air simply by way of suggesting just possibly it's time for us to think about this, and even as we do our own work, to see whether there are ways we can actually do real things to aid it along rather than to resist either by attitude or by action. So that's the kind of sermon, you didn't know you're coming for a sermon, but that's the context I want to give you about, and then I'm going to give you some really concrete things that I hope will give you some further idea about that. And one final indication. The Next System Project has as its members, the one that David Orr and I have started. How many know the name James Gustav Speth? Gus Speth? Gus Speth and I are co-chairing it. We have last year's president of the American Political Science Association is there, the president of the American Academy of Management, and the past president of the American Sociological Association are all raising this question as a formal way to open the debate. Enough said. If you actually look at some of the questions that have been talked about at this conference, I suspect everyone knows that power is one of the issues, unspoken, and usually corporate power, that is standing in the way of many of the solutions that you might want. That there is an issue of institutional political power, that's also a systemic design problem. What is the design of the power institutions? But we know that institutions, for instance, they killed the Clean Air Act or they watered it down because there was very powerful corporate pressure and political power involved in it. When I worked in the House and the Senate, it was still possible to regulate corporations to a substantial degree. Now, let me talk about the architecture of that because it leads to the next part of that. In most advanced industrial societies, the political science literature is very clear that the capacity in general, and it varies in different areas, to actually manage and regulate and pass legislation of a generally social democratic or liberal or progressive way in the environment and elsewhere depends upon an alliance of activists usually and labor union power in particular. Labor union power often fought with environmentalists, but it produced enough power to begin to counterbalance the corporate structure and pass environmental and social legislation in most countries. Labor unions have gone from 35% of the labor force organized in the United States down to 11% and 6% in the private sector and declining. So either there will be a buildup of new institutions to undergird the power of the next transformation, or the trends that you all know about, and they are in almost every area, down declining trends and stalemate will probably get worse. What is interesting, and this is what research that we've been doing, and a number of people have been doing, is that on the ground, there is a very interesting and hardly reported press, because the press doesn't have capacity to report it. Newspapers are very difficult. Buildup of new institutions that are suggesting both immediate answers to environmental and economic institutional power problems, and beginning to open up ideas that are very, very interesting in terms of their political possibility. So-called new economy movement, how many know about that? There is a new economy movement out there. There's a huge conference this weekend actually in Boston, and there's another one next weekend in Oakland, and there's a lot on the ground that hasn't been reported, but what it has to do with is the sort of thing I'm going to describe to you. In Cleveland, this is one prototype. In Cleveland, in the midst, and now we're about the racial justice as well, in the midst of a community of 40,000, extremely poor community, 40% unemployment, family income 18,000, extraordinary poverty, but also a university, Case Western Reserve, the Cleveland Clinic, and a university hospital right in the middle of this poor community. What's been built in that community, and is now in many other communities, I'll tell you about it, is an interesting structure of worker community ownership. Draw a circle, nonprofit corporation for the community, worker-owned companies off of it, and the purchasing power of these big institutions sustaining a community-building, environmentally green at every level set of structures. Now, when I say worker-owned companies, they're not little companies. The largest greenhouse, urban greenhouse in the United States is one of these companies. It is online to produce 3 million heads of lettuce a year under worker community democratic ownership. Another one is a large-scale industrial solar installation company. Probably will put in more capacity than exists in the entire state of Ohio over the next 3 years. And a third is an industrial-scale green laundry to service hospitals, et cetera. Again, very green, a third of the water, a third of the heat, probably the greenest in the Midwest, and building out a structure that doesn't look like corporate capitalism, doesn't look like little tiny co-ops, and has a power building base in that city. Two things to say about it. Many, many, many communities are now looking at what's called the Cleveland model, the evergreen model, but it changes who owns the power, who owns capital, who owns wealth, and it builds community, and it is very interested in the green problem. Part of it has to do with the throwaway, what I call the throwaway city problem. In places like Cleveland, cities have gone from 900,000 to less than 400,000 over time. Where did the people go? They went elsewhere at extreme carbon costs, throwing away the existing houses, roads, streets, hospitals, schools, and then building them up elsewhere at capital costs and carbon costs, and undermining the capacity to do interesting things with mass transit, undermining the capacity to get high-density housing, and undercutting, because there's no stability, many of the programs that as a sustainability project many of you work on in communities would be possible. The restabilization of those communities becomes one of the key issues. And the Cleveland model, as it builds around the country, many cities are interested. Jacksonville, Florida is now attempting it, Atlanta. There are 3 projects in the Washington, D.C. area. There's one in Texas. We've been involved in this. There are over 100 cities now trying to find ways to build out and build institutional power that is different from the usual suspects. So that's the kind of things happening around the country. There are, over the last 30 years, worker-owned companies have gone from 250,000, and they are community stabilizers. Worker-owned companies do not get up and go, like corporations that come in with a big tax benefit and get up and then leave afterwards. They've gone from 250,000 to 12,000 people. There are 10,000 corporations, 12 million people. There are 10,000 such corporations. It's on an upward swing. There is something brewing at the level of changing who owns the power and how do you stabilize communities and how do you integrate it with a climate agenda, a green agenda in general, and a sustainability agenda as well. So I'm giving you this sort of outlines of something that's percolating out there that needs to be seen as allied with what we're doing, needs to be reported on, but also asking you to consider with me if we are potentially at a place where we face a systemic crisis, a crisis of corporate capitalism and one of state socialism, how do we begin to imagine and think through what the next system might be? And then how do we think about processes, even as we do what we do every day, that allow us to begin to move in a new direction simultaneously? The Chinese have a wonderful phrase, how do we walk on 2 feet? How do we move what we can do in the existing system, but also aid and abet what is done elsewhere? The civil rights movement is a good example. Civil rights people, and I remember this I worked in the Senate at that period as well. There were people, even in the worst civil rights situations in the South, working in government and universities, who found a way somehow to help the new movements. And it was a critical part of what was going on, the allies within the system. And I suggest that many of us, as the new economy movement builds, as change begins to develop new consciousness, as the projects begin to develop, we will be put in the position of nudging it forward or holding it back because it's a little too edgy, it's a little bit too dramatic. And I urge that you consider that possibility as we go forward in your own roles and your own jobs. Let me give you a sense. I was asked to talk about governance, and I want to talk about it in a little different way than perhaps some of the other speakers have talked about it. How is it that the experiment that I talked about in Cleveland and its next iterations are going to get bigger and broader as they go forward, how did that happen? And what is governance if you look at it as a historical phenomena and as a political economic phenomena rather than as a legal phenomena? Here's the tale. And it's again a tale about how transitions in different systems take place if you look closely. In 1977, you mentioned this, Youngstown Steelworkers, a major 5,000-person steel mill in Youngstown, Ohio, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, went down. 5,000 people lost their job on one day. That was huge news then. It's not news anymore because it happens all the time now. And the steelworkers there said, why don't we take over this mill, and why don't we set it up as a community/worker-owned mill and change who owns the power base of this system? And they got the Carter administration to finance a very professional study. They got a commitment for a $200 million loan guarantee, which was a lot of money those days. That's a triple of that now. And they were ready to go forward. They got the best people in the steel industry, experts, to help them design it. And they produced a plan that was financeable. And then after the election of 1978, they thought Carter would really pay attention to this. The Mahoney Valley was important to Democratic votes in Ohio. The money disappeared. But these people understood their role in a way that I'm kind of suggesting to you. They thought the most important thing, even if they didn't win this battle, was to educate other people in the state of Ohio and around the country. They had the religious coalition with them, that their problem was not just what they were doing, but how to begin opening up different space. So if you look after over 30 years in the state of Ohio, and I'm suggesting this because this process we're seeing in many parts of the country, over many years, there are more worker-owned companies in the state of Ohio, probably per capita, than almost any other state. Now, why did that happen? It happened because there was active education and furthering. They set up a little institute at one of the universities, Kent State University. The idea was in the air, and activists picked it up, and now what's going on in Youngstown drew on that. So did governance happen because somebody decided to set something up in Cleveland? Or was the impetus from citizen action building up over time and understanding themselves as actors in history that laid the groundwork so that what became possible, in fact, happened? So the level of individual action, and there are many people who were involved in pushing this and developing this historical idea, and in the new economy movement right now, you're seeing this kind of action, self-conscious awareness that they're trying to build something for the future that either is laying the ground for something called systemic transformation, or is building a new power base to enforce and enhance sustainability activities of a more routine and usual and conventional kind. But they are self-conscious about it. They are aware that unless we build power and institutions, almost certainly the institutions that have power will stymie or restrict or narrow or constrain or keep in a nice little box what people think is the most important thing to do in the future. That's an intense argument. It's a suggestion that we cannot accept the role simply of research or government official, that if we want to move the ball, we are going to have to find ways to confront these issues of institutional power, and particularly institutions that own and control capital, because that's how systems are designed. The power usually goes to where the wealth is, and to begin building from the bottom up and seeing how much we can do to advance that. There are many parts of this that we could go into, but I want to give you a flavor of some of the other things going on, all of which have to do with this. If you look at the notion of city participation in this institutional power structure, some of you may have seen in Boulder, California, municipalized its utility in order to change the output of gases to get it into a clean format and a green format. If you look at Richmond, California, pay attention to Richmond, very interesting city. They are using eminent domain powers to do very different things with the city government, all of which they're also solar and green and co-op building as well, using city powers. Jackson Rising in Mississippi. How many know about Jackson Rising? Extraordinary activity now in the Deep South, also around these same themes. There are 20 states that have introduced legislation to set up state-owned banks to finance this sort of thing. How many know about the Bank of North Dakota? This is the kind of information that's just not out there, but is happening in the new economy movement. The Bank of North Dakota has been their state-owned bank, socialist bank if you like, one of the most conservative states of the country now politically, and there is a 99-year-old state-owned bank in that area. 20 states have introduced legislation to further this same concept. I'm getting the 5-minute signal, so I'm just trying to give you a sense of some of the things that are on the ground. There are 140 million Americans in co-ops now, and the co-op movement is building. Again, another way to democratize ownership, again taking on a green line. There are banks that are called credit unions, conventional credit unions. They control, it's a one person, one vote bank. They control $1 trillion in capital, some of it now going to finance these kinds of experiments. So I gather my good friend David opened up some of the large themes about revolution or transformation or changing the system. And I'm suggesting to you, and I want to open it up for a little bit more dimension, that just possibly those large rhetorical themes, when you actually start boiling them down, piercing them, and looking at what's going on the ground, you begin to see the elements of a potential system that builds from the bottom up, that begins to transform step by step, that is integral to the environmental movement, that begins to think about democratization from the bottom up, and is also, to use a common word, it's also hip about the institutional power question, that unless we build power and institutions that are different from the major corporate structures and from the state socialist structures, unless we do that, the power institutions will control the action in terms of sustainability, climate change, and resilience. So that's the bottom line. I find one of the most interesting parts of historical change is not only the sequencing from Youngstown up to Ohio to Cleveland and on to many cities around the country, how the idea system and how the activism and how that disperses. That's really interesting. The other part of it's interesting is at the level of ideas. People have ideas that restrict or open themselves to new change. And that's even harder and more interesting in the periods, the prehistory of the American Revolution, the prehistory of the feminist movement, the prehistory of the environmental movement itself. A whole set of ideas had to open up to allow people to see themselves as part of something different. I'm a hard-headed Paul. I've been there, done that in the institutions we now have. But I'm also a historian. And what we tend to do, famous historian once said, we tend to remember the future. Now, what does that mean? We think of the future by remembering what has been happening and applying that to the future. Almost certainly a way to make a big mistake if you are living in a time of change. We believe it will continue. I do not think systemic change is inevitable. It may get much worse. We haven't seen violence given the poverty trends and the income trends and the dislocation and what's going on in the income distribution. It is possible we will simply see decay and more stalemate and decay. It's also possible that out of the pain and out of the difficulty and out of the awareness, particularly in the environmental movement, that we may begin to lay groundwork for something really transformative, and that the idea system and the projects and the elements that begin to give content to a new possibility, it's also possible that that option may develop, and that, to put it more bluntly, that I am talking to the person in your chair, that we may actually participate in the construction of that possibility. Now, the strikingly interesting thing about it in any event is no one can predict how far these developments of bringing power together, institution building, and serious environmental change, no one can predict how far that may go together, how far they may go. What is clear is that every step in that direction is positive in furtherance of the goals in any event. And it is also clear that more and more people, some of it reported in the press, some of it not, are beginning to open themselves to very strange ideas that go well beyond how dreary and stalemated politics is and how terrible what's going on the ground in many poor communities is, to asking what might be possible. Forgive me, I'm from Wisconsin. I was a young kid in Wisconsin when Joe McCarthy was senator. Joe McCarthy, as you may recall, attacked everything politically in the United States that moved halfway inch to any liberal idea, and certainly to the left. You're all communists. In Wisconsin, it was 10 times as bad. They shot anything that moved politically that had a new idea. And so if you remembered the future in Wisconsin and you predicted what was going to happen, you knew for sure nothing really could change. Some of you may actually believe that. You knew for sure nothing could really change. And then the 60s exploded. Contrary to every projection, academic projection, every newspaper projection. I am not suggesting to you that we're going to have an explosive change, though it is a logical possibility. I'm suggesting that we live in a time when some very, very powerful trends are opening the way for much different kinds of projects, much different kinds of thinking, and just possibly a different change. I want to leave you with a challenge, one little challenge. You should never trust a speaker when they say that, but I'm going to leave you with one challenge. Might it be possible that you and I live at the most interesting point in American history, bar none? That we are at that moment when a decaying system continues to decay, and the seedlings maybe of something transformative are struggling to be born. Might that be where we are? And in any event, it's a pretty good idea to water the seedlings no matter what. Thank you very much.
It would be awesome if you guys had questions, because I hope you guys do. Yeah, we already have one. Great.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I was, it got me to thinking about a number of things that happened that we were talking about during the conference. And one of the overriding themes was how successful things at the local levels have been, how small things have worked. And even across, the guy from Kansas was saying across what we would normally think right and left, and when you get to the local level, it doesn't matter. It's what's working and what the community wants to do and how the community might save itself or move forward, et cetera. But there's a certain point where it reaches the, it begins to reach the upper echelons of the, power elite, for lack of a better word. And then suddenly the voices of divisiveness and the corporate stronghold on purchasing our government and corporate money, et cetera, begins to sort of shove at things. So the small seedlings from below seem to be flourishing, but there seems to be a real problem at the top. And how can that ever, how can we keep the top from just crushing it out because it's not in their best interest?
And so the answer, obviously, we don't know, and it is possible that this movement will lose. Logical possibility. On the other hand, what is driving the movement is at least two levels of pain. One is real physical pain, and people in great duress, economically, socially, equity, particularly black and brown, but also many poor white and also middle-class people in duress for their understanding and their moral concern for the society. That there's many kinds of duress that are going on. We live in a period, I think, of stalemate and stagnation and decay. Not a revolutionary period, not a collapse, but ongoing, driving people to understand something's wrong. The power structure always has the power. The question, in my view, is not whether we have a revolution, but whether we have an evolutionary reconstruction, whether we build power slowly, steadily, win here, win there, It may be that they will come down on us. It may be that they won't, or they will, in selective areas, will say successful. I don't know. But I do know, as a historian, great transformations are historically possible all the time. The Berlin Wall fell, apartheid collapsed, the feminist revolution succeeded. So it is a mistake to prejudge that. And that's what I was really talking about as a government official. Prejudging, well, it's very bad now. Obviously, this is going to continue. Remember the future. It may be that nothing is possible. I'm willing to concede that as a logical option. But that is also the way it always looks before great change happens. So you pays your money, you takes your chances. Sir?
Just really quickly, if both of you can ask your questions and then have him respond, we're going to have to cut it after that because we're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you.
Joe Browder, I was a friend of Gaylord's too. And would just like to say, as optimistic as you could be, and I would be too, about so many good things happening at local levels all around the world. It would be really good to hear your thoughts about two things that I think really prevent a lot of this change from going forward. One is lack of participation in the political process by most people in this country. What could be done about that? Because unless you have more people participating, then all of us are a minority. And the second is the intrinsic corruption in our government, particularly at the local government level. And it's just true. I mean, we don't like to discuss it, but anybody who's ever dealt with zoning politics in any city in America understands this. And I think that the element of corruption that exists in most of our decision-making processes at the local level is so strong that that's probably at least as much of a ceiling on change as any corporate oppression might be. So I'd appreciate your response to both of those.
Three comments. One of the things that's interesting about the development I mentioned in Cleveland, which is socialization of the means of production by worker-owned companies, if you like. Small business conservatives in that city, business people like it. People are hardworking, they get to own something, piece of the action, they're building the community. So we're finding interesting allies politically in many cities who want to see something practical and are not interested in the ideology. So the point of that is that they're interesting allies. I think the only answer to what you're talking about is if you look at the progressive era, where the corruption was even worse, a movement, largely middle class in that case, reacted to that, as in all cases, there's a reaction to the corruption, the institutional power, and you built new power. Without that, nothing ever happens. We live in a moment where we see the difficulties, and it is possible they will persist forever. But it's also possible that people understand it's time to act up and begin to move, acting on that. I think the Occupy groups and the people say the Occupy movement is dead. My experience, I've been lecturing around the country on my book, my experience sociologically is that out of the Occupy movement, people who had not done politics, were isolated, came together for a brief moment, they met each other, and now you find around the country people who didn't know each other and didn't know they could do political things. Small groups have come out of that. Friends who they didn't know before are doing things all over the country that are well below the radar because the press doesn't cover it. So any political movement that addresses the questions you're raising, I think inevitably builds that way. I don't think there's another answer, but you actually have to engage it and try it, or you're for sure going to lose. But there's a lot of evidence that old power structures can be beaten down. Do we have one more?
I apologize, actually, because my question was related to the last one, because I wanted to ask if you would assess, say, the level of healthiness, if you will, of civic engagement generationally and where we're going besides social movements and just with the average citizenry, I guess. And if I may frame this with an example, there's an interesting piece from a sociologist named Adam Greenfield, who's now at LSE Cities, writing on smart cities, and he actually was critical of, say, CCTV cameras, surveillance cameras, which, if you've lived in London, you know are pretty much ubiquitous in every corner, but actually saying in this example that the presence of CCTV cameras everywhere actually meant that people were less likely to actually engage in public space of say, antisocial behavior, crime or whatever, because they feel like someone else is taking the problem, the state is taking care of the problem, and so that, just as an example, you don't have to address that specifically. So I'm just wondering if you can just speak about like where do you find American civic engagement, or level of civic engagement being generationally? Because I'm not optimistic. And you certainly have given good examples of social movements and then how that they have greater connectivity to each other than maybe was possible before. But just for a real sort of paradigm shift, maybe demographically, what are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
So there is no obvious perfect answer to that question. But what I can see, and one of the really big problems is the collapse of the American press, financially. That is, newspapers locally do not have staff anymore, given what's happened in the internet and given what's happened to advertising. They do not have staff to cover what's going locally. And the national press certainly doesn't, which means that you live in a desert of information on what is actually happening in activism locally. You don't know because there is no reporting. So my answer to you, I'm going to give you, the answer is to give you whatever we've been able to find in systems that are attempting to report on this. The first one is, I'm going to give you two websites. The first one is community-wealth.org. Put the dash in because there's one without the dash that won't get you. And you'll find literally thousands of examples of the kind of thing I'm talking about, and you'll get a sense of what's happening around the country. The other one is the neweconomicscoalition.org. And that will give you some sense of the political side of what I'm talking about that's happening out there. So part of the challenge becomes actually finding ways to communicate that other people are doing things and doing it successfully, which is the ingredients that challenge pessimism. And that if you can see it can be done in one community, if they do it over there, why can't we do it here? And also give you a sense, not only that it can be done, but also that there's a movement of people out there that is in fact supportive and interested in the same things. But that doesn't resolve your problem. And in fact, there's no way to resolve the problem except personally. It is in the end an existential question of whether one tries to actually go forward in a new direction. It's really personal, knowing that there are great uncertainties, or whether you accept the current moment of not possible as the inevitable not possible. And you need to look in the mirror tomorrow morning and the next morning, say, which side of that question am I on? Am I going to try or not? Do I accept the common wisdom or not? So I often say, probably this is the best last word that I can give you, systemic change is not about political economic systems in the end, though it is, in my view, and I write a lot about it, and that's what I spend my time writing about these days. It's personal and existential, whether you can get on top of the question of, can I, living in the strange moment we live in, both do what I can do and be open to this other possibility in a time of great pessimism and decay. So that's the struggle. It is not a big intellectual problem. It is very, very personal and can only be, I think, engaged the way people in the women's movement did it, the way the civil rights movement did it, the way the early environmental movement did it, before they were movements. I can leave you with that. Thank you very much.
All right, well, what a great way to end this summit. I think he tied together a lot of things that at least I personally have been thinking about, especially it's a concept, the notion of power has been talked about a little bit, or has been talked about a lot, but maybe not as directly as he did when speaking about environmental justice. We talked about power issues. When we speak about governance in general, we talk about the interplay between different organizations and institutions and groups of people, and the dynamics between them. And I think calling that power at the end sort of ties a lot of things together that we've been talking about, maybe implicitly. So thank you so much again for coming and sharing your thoughts. And it's a fantastic way to sort of draw out and put everything that we've been talking about in a larger context. And building a climate movement, I think, is extremely urgent, to echo David Orr. And so I thank you all so much for participating. I want to do a personal shout out to the organizing team, and maybe you guys can come on stage. I was going to go to a happy hour, and James and Elise called me up. They're like, hey, we want to talk to you. And so I met them at Kramer Books at DuPont Circle, and they're like, we're planning this summit. You should help. And I was like, okay, totally. This sounds awesome. And this, I think James and Elise have been talking about this for a very, very long time, and they've put a lot of effort into it along with the arena. And so I kind of personally want to thank you guys for this. But I want to thank you guys so much, everybody here, for participating in this. Please keep in touch. We're going to maintain our email address, resilience.summit@gmail.org or gmail.com, and we'll try to keep in touch with you guys if you're interested about things that we're planning on doing, follow-up stuff, writing, and so on. So thank you so much again, and we'd like to thank AAAS for giving us the space and the resources for doing this, and all the speakers and participants. Thank you so much. Spread the word and keep the conversation going. It's a very urgent one. Thank you.